Excited today because we have Jim Marrs with us. Jim has been studying 9/11 ever since it happened. He wrote The War on Freedom. HarperCollins censored it. He had to publish it privately. Now he's back with a revised version of it called Inside Job, plus a remarkable new DVD. He's going to be talking about it to our subscribers, one of the most incredible paranormal events ever, The Secret of Redgate. Jim, I'm so glad to have you on the program.
Oh, Whitley, it's always good to be with you.
Well, it's always exciting to have you, and I really, in reading Inside Job, I began to see that you have gone beyond where you were with the War on Freedom in a lot of different ways.
Right.
But let me just begin by asking you, if I may, where this all began for you. You must have, like the rest of us, waked up to 9/11 on that day. What was going through the mind of Jim Marrs that morning?
Okay. Yeah, you're right. Since I stay up late at night, I was still pretty much in bed when the phone rang, and it was my wife calling from school saying, "You better get up. New York is under attack." And, of course, my first thought was, what the heck is she talking about?
Yeah.
And immediately turned on the TV, and I was in time to see the reporting on the North Tower, and enough time to sit there and watch the plane crashing into the South Tower as it happened. And of course, I was simply stunned, like everybody else, like what in the world is happening here? As the day progressed, though, I very quickly came to the idea that this was a conscious attack. Another thing that struck me was that, we've had a lot of things happen, like the Murrah Federal Building bombing and the bombing of the World Trade Center back in 1993. And in all those instances, the general idea was that, well, this is not any big conspiracy. But this was obviously a big conspiracy. To be able to move that number of hijackers, to be able to get them through normal security, to be able to get at least 4 commercial airliners. And Whitley, you know as well as I do that there is some evidence to suggest that there may have been more included in the original plan, but for one reason or another it ended up 4. But still,
right.
For that to have happened takes considerable planning, considerable expertise, obviously lots of money, and long-range planning. So my next thought was, we need to stop and not let our emotions get the better of us at this particular point in time, and we need to calmly and coolly find out who is truly behind these attacks and make sure that they are punished and that they never happen again. And in fact, I published something to that very extent on September the 12th, the very next day.
On September the 12th?
Yes.
Wow.
And I said, this is, this is, already they were comparing it to Pearl Harbor, which is a very apropos comparison, but not for the reason that most people think. They think, oh yeah, it was another dastardly sneak attack. Well, what we know now about Pearl Harbor, and has become abundantly clear and is generally accepted, is that President Roosevelt, George Marshall, a handful of others, very ranking government people, knew that Pearl Harbor was going to be attacked. And they allowed it to happen to further their own political aims, which at that time was to galvanize the American public. Now, September the 11th, I think, if you'll actually study the available information, is the exact same thing. There were people high within the government who obviously knew this was going to happen. We have the arrest of members of an al-Qaeda cell in the Philippines back in 1995, where they uncovered the plans for Operation Bojinka, which called for hijacking airplanes and flying them into targets. You have the warnings that were coming up through the ranks and files of the CIA and the FBI, which have now been made public. But it's been spread out over a period of time, so most people don't realize how voluminous these warnings actually were. We were getting warnings from everybody, including Russia, including the Taliban in Afghanistan, warning that Osama bin Laden was about to launch a major attack. Okay, and yet nothing was done. Now, what you're going to find out in my new book, Inside Job, is that there is an explanation for the most widespread criticisms of the Bush administration on that day, and that was the singular lack of response to these attacks. Where were our interceptor aircraft? Where were the missile batteries that ring Washington, D.C.? Where were the alarm bells going off within the FAA and the tight communications between the FAA and NORAD, the North American Air Defense Command? And why did President Bush continue to read a story of a billy goat to school kids after he had been informed that a second plane had struck the World Trade Center and that America was under attack?
You know, Jim, when I was in the theater watching 911, and I certainly, even though I'm not a lefty at all, I went to it because I think that what is happening is very far beyond the normal politics.
Exactly.
Where we are right now has nothing to do with your political ideology. We're in trouble with people who are using a certain political ideology to do something that is very different from what those who believe in conservatism would want them to do if they knew what was going on. And I sat in that theater, and during the time where they had the imagery of Bush just sitting there staring with this funny little look on his face, and there were people sobbing. There were sounds of people suppressing fear, little noises like that in the theater, dead silence. And I had to tell you, I thought of you, and I thought, I wonder if Jim can tell us what must have been going on in that man's mind while he sat and waited, in my opinion, to make sure it all unfolded without his intervention.
Right. Now, yes, I think I can, and actually, on the one hand, it's kind of the defense for Bush, okay? Because what I have found and what I document in my book, Inside Job, is that this has not been widely publicized, but on the morning of September the 11th, 2001, when Richard Clark, the then head of counterterrorism, called NORAD and asked if fighters had been scrambled, the first thing he was told was, we're in the middle of an exercise. Whitley, they had a war game going on, okay? And it was called, Clark refers to it in his book as Valiant Warrior. My information is the true name was Valiant Guardian. And they were running these scenarios. And also, according to the information I have, one of the scenarios was that hijackers had hijacked commercial airliners and were going to fly them into prominent buildings. So in other words, the answer for the lack of response is that when the air traffic controllers began to report airplanes off course, out of touch, when the first reports came in and said a plane has crashed into the World Trade Center, when George Bush was told a plane has crashed into the World Trade Center, the thought was, oh, it's part of the exercise. But now this leads to even deeper, darker questions, and to me proves up the point of my title, Inside Job. Because what we now know is that the day before, the National Security Agency had intercepted an electronic communication from Mohammed Atta, who we are told was the leader of the hijackers, and he says, the match begins. Tomorrow is 0 hour. The match. He didn't say the operation begins, the op is on, the battle starts. He said the match, which is another word for the game. So in other words, how this leads to the big question. How did the hijackers know when to coordinate their true attack with this war game that had a similar scenario?
Jim,
and it could only have come from somebody within our own government.
Within our government.
It's
okay.
An inside job.
Listen to this. On 25 September of 2001, Unknown Country published a story that went almost nowhere in the media. Terrorists had our secret codes.
Yes.
Official sources now confirm the terrorists knew the White House codes and a number of secret signals, meaning that Air Force One containing President Bush could have become the terrorists' next target. Now, during 9/11, the movie, Michael Moore mentions in passing that they were using cell phones to communicate from Air Force One. because they couldn't even use their own communication system. Now, apparently...
Because it had been compromised.
It had been compromised from within.
Exactly.
Now, let's race forward to the...
well, wait, before you get past that,
sure.
Let me add one little coda here. This is something that really boggles my mind, and I'm not sure you've even thought about this.
I probably haven't.
When Bush made his trip to Florida, it was a publicity thing. You know, he's going there to take photo op pictures with the school kids. They had published the motorcade route. They knew which airport he was landing at and what the motorcade route was to the school and the route back to Air Force One. Okay? Now, going there, that's fine. But once at the school, he's informed that America's under attack. They now know they have our secret codes. They now know and believe that Air Force One and the president himself may be the object of an attack.
We have to take a break, Jim.
Whisk him off by a secret route? No. They quietly go back the very same route that they had already publicly announced. They go back to Air Force One, which takes off without any jet fighter escort.
We have to take a break. This is Whitley Strieber. It's Dreamland. We'll be right back. This is Whitley Strieber. It's Dreamland. We're back. When we're left the air, Jim's mind was boggled by the fact that Air Force One took off on 9/11 from Florida without even a jet escort and headed west. Now, why would that be, Jim? Did they know that they wouldn't be attacked? Is that what they were doing?
That's the only explanation that comes to my mind. If they truly thought that the White House codes and Secret Service codes were compromised and that the President and Air Force One may have been a target, I believe I'd put him on another plane. Or I believe I would have flown a alternate route than the one that had already been made public. And of course, later, sometime later, he did kind of disappear. They took him from one air base to another, and there was some public question as to where in the heck was the president anyway.
During the course of the afternoon, there certainly was.
But, this reminds me in the aftermath of the Kennedy assassination when then President Johnson was telling everyone around Parkland Hospital that he thought this could be the start of a communist attack, and yet he goes off and goes back to Air Force One and leaves the military officer with the nuclear launch code standing around at Parkland Hospital. Wait a minute. Obviously, he wasn't that concerned about a communist attack, or he would have kept that officer code name football right at his elbow.
You would think so.
Same thing here. If they truly thought President Bush was under threat, then they would have whisked him away, taken a different route, put him on a different plane, and done everything possible to prevent, a possible attack on him.
Now, do you think that it could have just been panic and confusion and inadequate people?
Well,
people who really weren't up to their jobs?
That's exactly what they've told us, isn't it? And that's exactly what they want us to believe.
Now,
and yet, let's just look at it this way. And unfortunately, I don't have the exact figures in front of me, but it is roughly this. One of the most effective and efficient intelligence services in the world is the Israeli Mossad. And their yearly budget is somewhere in the neighborhood of $370 million, something like that. A lot of money, but it's a drop in the bucket compared to what we spent in the year 2000, 2001. We spent over $30 billion, that's with a B, $30 billion on intelligence and defense, and a good portion of that, at least 10 to 15 billion dollars, was going into our anti-terrorism efforts. Okay, I'm sorry, Whitley, but with spending that kind of money and getting the kind of result we got on September the 11th, which now is a detail in my book, Inside Job, there was such an immense amount of warnings coming in about what was going to happen. Heads should have rolled long before now.
Yes. Well, and not only did they not roll, but the 9/11 Commission has come up with what looks to me like a whitewash where they point the finger at the CIA. As soon as I saw George Tenet was resigning, I knew what was up.
Can you spell scapegoat?
Exactly, because during and after, for a couple of years, and even after and during, I listened to the whole, sat here and listened to every word of testimony in that, and it was abundantly clear during the hearings themselves that the Pentagon and the Defense Department had ignored the CIA's warnings at the instructions of the White House. It could not have been more clear. They nailed them on that time and again. And then the report itself comes out with the same testimony between the covers, and they say it was all the CIA's fault in order to deflect criticism away from the presidency. And it's an outrage, just incredible. But what is more incredible is you're saying that it goes far beyond that. That we're not looking at incompetence anywhere. That somebody did this. Who did it, Jim? Who did it?
This was an inside job.
Who did it?
All right. Now, you also have to look at one other piece of information that I think will help tie all this together for you, Whitley, and your listeners. About a year ago in Pakistan, American forces arrested a man by the name of Abu Zubaydah.
Right.
And then White House spokesman Ari Fleischer made a big deal about this and said this guy was the most high-ranking al-Qaeda chief that we've caught to date, and by golly, we're going to make him talk. Well, they did. But you don't hear much about it because what he revealed was that he was secretly working for 3 Saudi princes. And he named them. And he gave his interrogators their private, unlisted telephone numbers, which proved to be correct. Okay? And within 2 months of this information leaking out, all 3 of these Saudi princes died. Okay? And 2 in a car crash, and 1 who was about 31 years old, and an Arab from an Arab country that
Jim,
said he died of dehydration.
We need to take a break. This is Whitley Strieber. It's Dreamland. We'll be right back. This is Whitley Strieber. It's Dreamland. We're back talking to Jim Marrs again. Tell us again about the Saudis. What exactly happened to them now?
Well, 2 of them died in automobile crashes, and the third, who was only about 31 years old, and an Arab who grew up in an Arab country, they said he died of dehydration.
Where?
In the see here if I can locate this while we speak. In Saudi Arabia. They were Saudis. And, of course, let's not lose sight of the fact that at least 15 of the 19 identified hijackers, at least half of which reports are from other news services around the world that they're still alive.
Now, why were these Saudis, why did they die? Assuming they were killed, what was to be gained?
Oh, well, to prevent this link between the Saudis and al-Qaeda from becoming commonplace knowledge. See, that's the thing, because let me just ask you, Whitley, you're well up on everything. Who is probably the best-known, most well-documented American close friends, social and business-wise, with the Saudi royals?
Well, George Bush Sr.
The Bush family.
Right, yeah.
Exactly. So now if we show that the Bushes are intimately connected to the Saudis, and the Saudis are actually financing and controlling al-Qaeda, that begins to sound a little suspicious, doesn't it?
It begins to sound very disturbing. What would be the motive for if the Bushes knew something enough about this and just let it happen, which is what it looks like? What would be the motive?
Well, the motive is there's several motives. And frankly, I think what we have here is the same thing that happened to President John F. Kennedy. It's not one motive, it's a convergence of several motives that finally just tips the apple cart over, you know?
Right.
In this case, you have oil. They were wanting a oil and gas pipeline through Afghanistan. But according to the reports I've seen, it was Osama bin Laden who, hiding in Afghanistan, advised the Taliban to hold out and to get a better shake from the American oil companies. And as a result, the pipeline went into hiatus. It kind of got put on hold in mid-2001. And there are credible reports that at that time, when these talks on the oil pipeline broke down, that the American negotiators were threatening the Taliban, saying, if you don't accept our carpet of gold now, you're going to get a carpet of bombs come the fall, which is exactly what happened.
Right.
All right, so there's one motive. You've got the other motive was to create a permanent U.S. military presence in the Middle East. And this was a goal of the Project for the New American Century, which is a neoconservative think tank which was issued a paper back about that same time and calling for a worldwide American empire imposed by military strength, and it included regime change in Iraq and attacks on Afghanistan. They had their game plans carefully laid out. And by the way, this position paper was based on a defense guidance policy paper issued by Dick Cheney when he was Secretary of Defense under the old Bush administration. So these were long-standing plans that they were wanting to carry to fruition. But even in their own documents, they understood and made clear that the American people would probably not go along with any of this unless there was another Pearl Harbor type incident that so galvanized and angered the people that they would be willing to go for this. So there's a huge, big reason for carrying this out. Of course, the other reason domestically is that they had been trying to push through. When I say they, I'm talking about the secret government, the shadow government, as we've finally been informed of, even by the mainstream media. The people inside who have deep connections both into intelligence and into the military who, George Bush, I guess, pretty well summed them up best himself when he said, yeah, it would sure be easier to operate if we had a dictatorship, you know? So this is what they're looking for, and of course, with the attacks of 9/11, which they claim were attacks on our freedoms and our liberties, what did they do? They began to tighten up on our freedoms and liberties with the Patriot Act and with the creation of Homeland Security, which is headed by a man who participated in Operation Phoenix, which during the Vietnam War claimed about 65,000 lives while they tried to pacify the Vietnamese population. Okay, so, you know, we're not getting any more freedom and democracy, that's for certain.
For sure, and also another thing that happened that troubles me a lot, and that is that before this, Bush was, he was not elected by a majority, and
he was not elected, period, according to the 3 recounts.
Right, and people were real unhappy with him as president at the time.
Right, his popularity was slipping, the economy was
low. I mean, it was never high, and it was always, the economy was in trouble, and this changed, it turned him around and made him into a viable president in just a stroke. And you know what worries me is that there could be people cynical enough and evil enough out there to actually have wanted this to happen for the same reason that Hitler wanted the Reichstag fire.
Exactly. Well, let me answer the question that you're basically getting to, which is, would Americans allow Americans to die in attacks that they could have prevented? Okay? And unfortunately, the answer is yes. We've already talked about Pearl Harbor, and I want to briefly mention Operation Northwoods. Now, this goes back to the Kennedy administration in the early 60s, and with the failure of the ill-fated Bay of Pigs invasion, Kennedy was angry at the CIA, realized they were incompetent when it came to launching a military invasion, so he turned the secret war against Castro over to the Pentagon. And their best and brightest there came up with Operation Northwoods. This was essentially a plan to hijack aircraft, hijack ships on the sea, set off bombs in selected American cities, and even target selected Americans for assassination, and then blame it all on Castro, so that they would galvanize the American public into a renewal of the invasion of Cuba. All right? And the important thing to remember about this, Whitley, is that, you know as well as I do that within the military, within intelligence, they're always coming up with contingency plans, and some of them are pretty crazy, okay?
Right.
But this particular plan was approved by the Joint Chiefs of Staff. They said, this is a good plan. We're going to do this. It was President Kennedy who said, no, we're not going to do this. That's not what this country's all about. And he ordered all the copies of Operation Northwoods to be destroyed, and apparently most of them were. But in delicious irony, in the early 90s, in the wake of the Oliver Stone movie, JFK, there was a hue and cry for all the government to turn over their documents concerning the assassination and things going on at that time period. And there was the creation of the Assassination Records Review Board. And guess who stumbles across the Operation Northwood documents, places them in the National Archives where they are now public? The Assassinations Records Review Board.
Yeah. Well, what do you know?
So, yes, they will allow attacks on other Americans to further their own purposes. And, Whitley, this goes back to what you said early in the program, which is, and I'm with you 100% on this is not a Republican or Democratic issue. This is not a conservative or liberal issue.
No.
This is criminality.
On a massive scale. And it's
on a huge scale.
Also why, if you look at what was promised before the election, that we would not engage in nation building, that the United States would not be projecting itself abroad, and that the United States would not be going into a very large debt, that that there would be tax cuts that would affect the individual.
Right. When
in fact the United States has been projecting itself abroad. We are horribly in debt.
We've run up the biggest debt in history.
In history, the tax cuts don't affect the small guy. They don't affect me. I don't think they affect you or really anybody I know.
Nope.
They affect the big guy, and there was just recently quietly passed through Congress this enormous big corporate tax break at a time when the country is heavily in debt, and it's not conservatism at all. It has nothing to do with conservatism. That's why I'm so incensed about it. It isn't. We do not have a conservative government.
No,
we have something else.
The hypocrisy of it is just mind-boggling. When Bush was finally forced to have a news conference here a month or so ago, and I listened to it, and it became, to me it was real clear. He came on first with a written statement, and he sounded calm and confident and in charge, and as he read his statement, which talked about bringing democracy to all the world and defending, freedom and liberty, and, everything he said, I could not argue with. It sounded great. The problem was he's not following up on that, and it's not happening. And, of course, then it went to questions and answers from the media, and the guy just fell apart. He couldn't even answer questions. In fact, to one question, he said, well, I wish you'd asked me that question on written previously in writing so I could have prepared an answer. Well, excuse me, Chief Executive, can't you give us an answer? Don't you have any answers? It's just absolutely incredible. And the other thing people seem to lose track of, and you know this and I know this, but I'm not sure many people stop and think about it, is that the patriarch of the Bush family, Prescott Bush, was actually prosecuted by the federal government in 1942 under the Trading with the Enemies Act for being nothing but a financial supporter of Hitler and his Nazis.
Well, through his Union Bank, in fact...
Union Bank, yeah. And then we find that George Sr., during his stint as vice president, while Reagan was recuperating from being shot, and as former director of the CIA, is directly responsible for arming and supporting Saddam Hussein.
Right.
And then we find out, through Texas court documents and business records, that George W. Bush apparently got his start in the oil business back in the 70s using investment money from the bin Laden family.
Right. And
okay? So in other words, the Bush family have supported our three worst enemies over the past 300 years. Don't you think someone should be kind of waking up and going, wow, maybe we better pick somebody else to lead this country?
Well, I would agree. And also, there's another worrisome thing, and that is that Prescott Bush's one of his major contacts within the Hitler's administration was a man named Heinz Roverer, who was Karl Rove's grandfather, and he was the Gauleiter of Mecklenburg, and absolutely convinced Nazi. And it bothers me. It bothers me because I have a lot of respect for my own grandfather and for his political beliefs, and they are by no means dead in my mind.
No.
And I don't think anybody's are. Our parents and our grandparents mean a lot to all of us. And listen, we're going to be coming up on another break in just a second here, but I just want to, before we go, what I want to say is this, that I'm really very concerned about this whole connection, and it has to do with the Valerie Plame affair, which I'm sure you know about, and which I'd like to talk about just in a couple of minutes when we get back. You know, Jim's book, Inside Job, Unmasking the 9/11 Conspiracies, is a terrific book, and you can get it from the unknowncountry.com store. If you're listening on the radio or as in our subscriber section, don't forget to go to the unknowncountry.com store frequently. It's a great place to buy books. It keeps this whole operation going. This is Whitley Strieber. It's Dreamland. We'll be right back. This is Whitley Strieber. It's Dreamland. We're back. You know, one of the reasons that Jim Marrs can say things on this program that really most other hosts are going to deflect him from saying and not want to talk about, or I'm casually talking about the relationship between Karl Rove and his Nazi grandfather, is because this program is genuinely free, and it's genuinely free because of you. You support everything we do by using our bookstore and by subscribing to unknowncountry.com. Now, Jim, let's talk a little bit about, and I know we're departing just a bit from the content of the book, but in a way we're not.
No, in a way we're not, because what seems to be shaping up, let me ask you if you see the same thing. It looks like they're going to use this Valerie Plame affair as a wedge to really possibly bring Cheney and or Bush up on charges.
Well, there's a grand jury meeting in Washington now, and I, of course, always have my doubts because there's so many pressures on grand juries nowadays.
Right.
That is, Bush has hired, interestingly enough, a criminal lawyer, and the reason he has done so is that he knew, apparently, who the leaker was, and did not say anything about this, which is did not report this to the FBI, which is in itself a violation of the law.
Well, I was going to say, doesn't that have eerie echoes of Nixon and Watergate? I mean, Nixon didn't break into the Watergate hotel, but he knew about it and didn't say anything about it.
With this difference, Watergate, well, having been intimately involved in politics back in those days and when I was growing up, I felt like Watergate was a very minor affair compared to some of the things I'd seen.
Exactly.
But anyway, this is no minor affair.
Again, though, Whitley, there is a good example of where the Watergate break-in itself, and certainly Nixon's reticence to even reveal it, all of that was relatively minor compared to some of the evils and sins that he was involved in, but yet that was what they used as a hook to get him. And I'm saying that this Valerie Plame affair could be the same type hook. This may not be what they should be getting him for, but this may be what they end up getting him for.
Right. Well, I don't know about that, though, and the reason, whether or not, because Valerie Plame was a very important person. She was a really important, because what has happened as a result of the outing of Valerie Plame is that our intelligence, our eyes and ears in Iran have been closed. We don't know anymore how valid intelligence out of Iran is, meaning that we don't know the degree to which Iran is building, and this is true of North Korea too, by the way, building and transporting or doing anything with nuclear weapons. And this woman, is the company that she worked for, and for those of you who are interested in pursuing this, go to unknowncountry.com and click on Whitley's Journal, and you can read more about this. This woman was very essential to the welfare of our country, and now, just at a time when it looks like Iran is frantically building nuclear weapons, we have been blinded by this leak, and it was a devastating blow to the American defense and to the welfare of the American people. And it gets me back to something I started to talk about earlier, which is we only have a couple of minutes right now, but I want you to just start talking about this. We talked about the communications problems back, and we talked about whether or not there was a mole in the White House at a very high level. We all need to ask the question, who is it? And Jim, what do you think about this? How do you react to that?
Well, for my money, and by the way, back when I had published my book Inside Job under the title War on Freedom, I actually had 11 remote viewers that I considered pretty reliable to take a look at 9/11, and one of the questions was, did George W. Bush have foreknowledge of 9/11? And their answer was no. But when I asked, did Dick Cheney and George Sr. have foreknowledge of 9/11, their answer was yes. So this tends to confirm what I kind of joke about down here in my own Texas way, which is I think George W. Bush is a post-turtle. Now,
what does that mean?
Post-turtle,
yeah.
And you've lived here in Texas, Whitley. You may know what I'm talking about. You go down the country road and you see a turtle up on a fence post, That's what's known as a post turtle.
Well, see, that's East Texas. West Texas, we don't have any turtles. Go ahead.
Well, you know that he didn't get up there by himself, and you know that he had to have help getting up there, and you know he can't do anything while he's up there, and all you want to really do is help the poor creature down.
This is Whitley Strieber. It's Dreamland. In just a couple of minutes, we'll be back with Jim Marrs, and we're going to figure out what this post turtle is all about. This is Whitley Strieber. We're talking to Jim Marrs about his new book, Inside Job, Unmasking the 9/11 Conspiracies. This is going to blow you away. I just have nothing else to say about it. War on Freedom was extraordinary, but Jim has tightened it up and added new material, and it is shattering, truly a shattering experience to read. Now, Jim, we were talking about the analogy of the post turtle just a couple of minutes ago. Why don't you just continue where you were?
Well, basically, that was somewhat trying to inject a little humor into a situation that probably lacks for any type of humor.
A bit, yeah.
Considering the severity of what we're talking about. But what the point is that Bush has been quite open and apparently proud of the fact that he doesn't read the papers, he doesn't watch the news, he doesn't listen to any kind of alternative viewpoints. He has surrounded himself with ideologues, and they tell him what he wants to hear, and they tell him what they want him to hear, and he's making his decisions accordingly, as any, like a post turtle. He's not there on his own, and he can't do anything on his own. And actually, I think this is pretty frightening, because I think a good leader should be open to all types of information, should look at all sides of every issue, and then make the best possible decision in the best interest of the widest possible number of people. But that's not where we're getting.
Not at all. The opposite, in fact.
Quite the opposite. And, of course, having studied the Nazis for so many years, and I know you particularly, you're very conversant with them, too. I think one of the most horrifying and one of the most pointed aspects of the Nazi ideology is that it was an ideology, okay? They had their particular ideas on how the world was and how the world should operate, and they set out with probably the greatest military machine the world had ever seen up to that point to instill and inflict that ideology on the rest of the world. And unfortunately, that's what I see happening with us today.
All right, well, I know some of the inner thinking within the conservative community behind what is a very serious desire to de-democratize in certain aspects the United States. And the reason is that if we run out of oil, this country is going to be under such pressure that a lot of the institutions that we cherish are really going to become inappropriate at that time. They're not going to be able to function in a situation where hundreds of millions of Americans are desperate, because I'm sure you remember the '73 oil crisis. I remember it very vividly, and
I do too.
Yeah.
And what we now know is that there was no crisis.
Well, except there was a crisis
for what was contrived.
What was contrived, but the point is that from the standpoint of the individual, this country runs on oil, and if you don't have it, you go from being the richest country in the world to absolute desperation in a heartbeat as soon as the car runs out of gas.
So are you perhaps comparing us with Japan prior to World War II, where
yes,
when
I
Roosevelt
am.
cut off their oil supplies, they were forced to essentially attack the world?
Right. That is exactly what I think is that. In fact, that's why I love having you on the show so much.
Right now.
I hadn't thought about that, but that is the most apt possible comparison. That is going on right now.
Okay,
how do you react
let me
to
tell you
that?
this, Whitley. If I truly, truly knew and truly, truly believed that oil was it, and that if we're out of oil, we're dead in the water, then I not only would totally agree with what your analysis, what you just said, I would even probably support this war against the world to protect our oil-run economy. But I know, not just believe, I know that there are alternative energy sources out there, and I think if we ran out of oil, it might be the best thing that ever happened to us, because then they would be forced to stop suppressing these alternative energy sources, and we could move on to clean, abundant, and non-polluting energy.
I wish I believed that hydrogen was a valid energy source. I don't.
It may not be hydrogen, but that's one possibility.
Right.
Biodiesel is another.
Right. There are a lot of possibilities, definitely, very definitely, and I think that.
But the most amazing thing, and actually, Whitley, this may lead us into another thing here that I don't even know how if we've talked about this before, but I think that in fact I'm preparing a new book right now that I'm calling it The Big Deep Dark Secret, and it has to do, and you are familiar with a lot of the work that's going on in this area. Because whether you want to call it anti-gravity or zero-point energy or whatever you want to call it, it is the manipulation of basic energy at the atomic and subatomic level. And this is an amazing thing that's going on, and what I'm finding out is that there are just telltale traces that this work has been going on ever since the Nazis were working on a super collider in western Poland towards the end of the war. And this technology was then passed to us, and it has been secretly used. There were a few public mentions of it in the early 50s, and then they clamped down a really serious blackout over this whole subject.
Right.
And now it's probably the deepest, darkest secret we have. Now, this is where we could draw energy just from the vacuum of space, just by rearranging molecules, et cetera, et cetera. And the amazing thing about this is that apparently this is nothing new, because with the recent discovery of monatomic elements, heavy metal elements, and when you say monatomic, that means they're made up of just one atom, okay, we are now finding that this fits in exactly with ancient lore and ancient knowledge, okay?
Right.
And then now that leads us to the recent discoveries in the ancient Sumerian cities of Uruk and Ur, which is, of course, now in the country of Iraq. And these recent discoveries, only made starting in 1999 through 2000, 2001, and early 2002, were all taken to the Iraqi National Museum, which was, of course, the object of an organized looting following in the wake of the American invasion. In fact, if you look at the invasion of Iraq, it did not follow standard and typical military tactics, which is to set up your objective, go for your objective, take your objective, and then consolidate your holdings, and then move on to your next objective. No, what we did was make a beeline for Baghdad and bypassing most of the countryside, which is now what's causing us all our trouble because we never stopped to pacify the countryside.
Well, we didn't even stop
to
disable
we just went right to Baghdad
or collect the weapons that the Iraqis left behind.
Exactly. And so why did we have to get into Baghdad? Well, the only thing that happened in Baghdad was the systematic and organized looting of the Iraqi National Museum that was led by people who knew exactly what they were doing, had glass cutters that were not commercially available in Iraq, bypassed expensive-looking fakes, went right to the basement, which is where the majority of still missing artifacts are. And in fact, Colonel Matthew Bogdanos, who investigated the museum looting for General Tommy Franks, said that it was an inside job. In other words, guards were missing. They had keys to certain things. They knew what they were after. And once you understand the connection between the manipulation of energy and the ancient scrolls and text and stone tablets that were then being recovered and taken to the basement of the Iraqi National Museum, I think it's not beyond the possibility to agree with Dr. Michael Sala, who says this was a cause celebre to enter Iraq to gain control over these ancient secrets, over the manipulation of basic energy.
Well, you know something interesting about the manipulation of energy or of anything at that level. It isn't going to work because there's a consciousness there that will simply not respond to that kind of approach. I know this very well, and I can assure whoever did this that what they took will have absolutely no usefulness to them.
It's not going to do them any good, is it?
None at all. No, because you get so close there to the mind of God that you find that the myth of Western science, that there's really nothing there, that it's all simply a passive phenomenon, is simply that, a myth. There is someone there. It's not passive. And the result, of course, is that the rest of us don't get the advantage of this wonderful, rich, flowing presence.
Exactly.
Because it is foreclosed by the wall of evil that lies between us and this.
And that may be the grandest conspiracy of them all.
Jim, we have come to an awesome point. We have about a minute left together. I don't want to say what are your last words,
no.
Where we are right now is at the edge of something that just never gets talked about. Give me about 30 seconds of Jim Marrs on this subject.
Well, what I'm thinking about right now is looking forward, and it does not look good because the best case scenario is that the American people finally come to their senses and realize, again, we're not talking politics here. We're not talking liberal conservative. We're talking people who care about this country and care about our relationship with the world. They come to their senses, and what's going to happen? Well, in November, they would vote for Kerry and Edwards, in which case, we have a choice of voting for Skull or Bone.
Yeah.
Well, you're going to get the same people controlling, regardless of who you vote for.
Regardless of who you vote for. Jim, this has been great. This is Whitley Strieber. It's Dreamland. Linda Moulton Howe is up next. One reporter who loves mysteries is radio's leading science journalist, Linda Moulton Howe. She's an Emmy Award-winning TV producer, documentary filmmaker, and writer, and reporter and editor for EarthFiles.com, the Internet's most respected edge science website. Today, she has a special report for us from a former Bendix employee who worked in the Apollo program at Cape Canaveral with first-hand eyewitness testimony about UFO events at the Cape. Here she is from Philadelphia, Linda Moulton Howe.
Thanks, Whitley. It was on June 21st of 2004 that I received an email from a man named Jim Oglesby. He's now a writer, retired from the U.S. Postal Service as a letter carrier in the most recent years, but he had worked for Bendix Corporation as a machine tool technician during the Apollo program at Cape Canaveral, Florida. Apollo 11 was the first mission to put the American flag and human footprints on the moon in the late 1960s, and its commander was aerospace engineer Neil Armstrong. Before Bendix, Jim served with the U.S. Navy from February 1962 to June 8, 1966, and spent time along the Vietnam coast. He did not see any unusual, unexplained aerial phenomena in Vietnam, but during the 1960s, around Cape Canaveral, he saw so many strange objects and beams in the sky, sometimes linked to the sudden aggressive appearance of military helicopters and jets, and once even a missile, that Jim began to wonder if something big was going on between the U.S. government and whatever was in these unidentified objects that the public and media commonly lumped under the popular slang UFOs. Here now is Jim Oglesby with an experience that shocked him as it unfolded from the early evening of December 30th, 1967, until after 1 o'clock in the morning on New Year's Eve. It began at the mobile home of his brother-in-law, where the family had gathered for a holiday dinner.
Well, John and I moved into the kitchen, and he was making a fresh pot of coffee. So while we were standing there chatting, his trailer faces north and south, and he had a small, at the time, a kitchen window faced east. And suddenly an amber golden glow reflected through that small window. And when it did, I was probably standing about 3 feet from the front door, and I leaped to the front door. I leaped, and I swung it open, and I stood on the porch, and I looked up, and at this time of the year, the moon just happened to be in a new moon phase, and it had already settled below the west horizon, so it was very, very dark outside. Well, I looked up, and I saw an amber ball about the size of a football. And I say amber ball, amber sphere, amber orb, and it seemed to be swirling and seemed to have electrical properties. And as soon as I looked at it, it went out. And
why did you think it had electrical properties?
Well, I was looking at it, and because it was inside of it was swirling, there was movement inside a confined area,
mm-hmm.
and it was like swirling around. It wasn't just an orange ball or an orange orb. It was active inside of itself. If that makes any sense.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, and this was about 100 feet above his mobile home and about 100 feet east of where I was standing. And just as it went out, and there was no sound attributed to this, it was very quiet. Just as it went out, I caught the outer rim of a circular object and the underbelly of what seemed to be a silver metallic substance, and then it just was swallowed up by the darkness.
Meaning that it seemed to be either fading out or disappearing?
Yes. And it must have been about 2 or 3 seconds later, right directly east, and in line of where that orange orb had seemingly vanished, I saw a red beam of light came on, and then it went off, came back on again, went off, came back on, and went off again. And it was moving very swiftly and away from me because it was getting smaller as it continued to move away from me. And then I noticed a disc or a round-shaped object, and I could see it from from where I was looking.
And we'll find out more about that in just a minute. This is Whitley Strieber. It's Dreamland. We'll be right back. This is Whitley Strieber. It's Dreamland, listening to this extraordinary story about UFO events at Cape Canaveral.
And it had a row of red flashing lights around the middle of it. And the lights were flashing like a left to right, right to left pattern. And within a second, another object moved up along to the right of the first one. And one rose, the other one descended, and then they reversed the up and down motion, and then they started dropping, rather like looking at a fallen leaf, below the tree line. And I could see them as they were dropping below the tree line in the distance. So I'm standing there looking, and then I see in the distance, east and right, well beyond where the two crafts or objects had seemingly landed, I saw some lights, and they were getting closer and closer, and pretty soon I could hear the familiar sound of blades thumping in the air, and there was helicopters. Mm-hmm. And there was a line of helicopters were in a straight line formation, and they were heading directly in the direction of where I had just watched the two objects land. And then I noticed two jets, and I could hear the roar of the engines were coming in from the south, and they crossed the area where I'd watched the two objects settling below the tree line, and they were very, very low. I thought they were going to clip the top of the trees because they were so low. Yeah. And they banked on out, turned around, and they banked back north, and I could hear the roaring of the jet engines while I'm also watching the formation of helicopters. And as they neared what it seemed like that they were close to the spot, they fanned out in a circle, and they switched on these really brilliant lights, and they were cone-shaped. They looked like searchlights to me, and they were flying around in a circle, and the beams of light were really doing what I would call some aerial surgery on the ground below. They were just trying to not miss a spot. Mm-hmm. And they did that probably for about a minute and a minute and a half, and then, oddly enough, they resumed their formation and headed back east, which I thought was very odd, because I know that I had just watched two objects settle below the tree line in the general area where they had approached. So I thought that was very odd that they would leave so, to me, it was very prematurely.
Yeah, it makes you wonder, what is it that they either did or thought that they did that then would sort of give them a reason to leave?
Yes, exactly. And that ended the activity for the time being. And now this event happened at around 7:10 that afternoon, and probably it was right around, I'm going to guess around 7:30 by the time the helicopters came in and the jets had made around, and the jets did not come back around again. They made one pass across their bank, turned back around, and headed back to the base.
And the helicopters stayed longer?
And the helicopters left too.
They did too.
They resumed their formation, and I watched them as they headed right back in a more east-southeast direction, which that would have been Patrick Air Force Base. And I'm standing on the porch, and I did not move from that position for hours and hours and hours. I stayed right there with my eyes locked on that area, and I don't know why, but I did. And at around 1:50 a.m., I'm looking straight out to where the two crafts had seemingly landed, and one of the row of red flashing lights began to move above the trees. And once again, I could see a circular object from where I was, and the row of red flashing lights were definitely right around the middle of this craft.
Mm-hmm.
And the red flashing lights were were moving in, like I said, a left to right, right to left pattern. And as the craft rose, that row of red lights got faster and faster and faster as the craft continued to ascend. And then it got up to an altitude, and it began to change into a more glowing effect around the craft. And then it paused, and then it shot up again, and it looked, from where I was looking, to be about half the size of its original shape.
Now, what was the color of the glow when it was glowing?
Very white.
So it went from red lights that were rotating rapidly to all white?
Yeah. When it rose up to a certain position, as it was rising to a higher altitude, I could see the white starting to fill in the area of where the red lights were, like as if it was changing vibrations and or fading.
Okay.
The lights seemed to be fading out as the white was becoming more prominent.
Okay.
And it paused. It went up on several very quick ascending spurts, and then it just hovered there, and it looked just like you would look at a star in the sky, except it was definitely very brilliant and larger than you would think of a star. And it sit there for a second, and then the eastern horizon lit up in a very like white, orangish, golden color, and it just spanned all across the eastern horizon. And moments later, a missile come up off, and you could see it rising in the air, and it got up, I don't know, maybe 50 degrees up off the horizon, and the star-like UFO zipped over to the left and came right up what looked like to me to be very close to the rocket. And it just hovered there, and then it shot back over to the right, and then it did a falling leaf pattern in the sky, and then it shot off to the right, paused, and then it was gone. And
when you say missile or rocket, are you talking about a launch of one of our shuttles from Cape Canaveral?
I'm talking about a Minuteman II rocket.
That missile. Somebody would have launched a missile?
Yes. I found out that it was a Minuteman II missile that was launched from one of the launch complexes. There's two of them that they launched those from, and that's what happened.
So what happened?
Well, I'm going to jump ahead, and we can come back to this point. But in April of which would be the New Year, '68,
right?
I was over at my parents' Easter weekend, and whatever the date Easter fell on, and I'm sitting in the living room, and I opened up what was then the Orlando Evening Star newspaper. It's no longer. It's now not in operation, but back then it was part of the Orlando Sentinel. And I was going through the paper, and I found a special edition in the newspaper, and I pulled it out, and I about flipped out. I said, I wasn't crazy. It said, UFO tracks Minuteman missile over Cape Canaveral, and they give the date and the approximate time. So I said, I got to keep this article, so I set it aside. And it ran in the I think the UPI press.
Right.
And I believe the gentleman that wrote the article, he's no longer alive now. His name was Dick Young, and I think he was a PR rep for Kennedy Space Center. But he had something to do with some of the operations, because he was certainly aware of this launch, because someone had, blabbed and it had become a leak.
We're talking about 1967 to 68.
Yeah.
How often were there any kind of missile launch exercises around Cape Canaveral?
It's interesting you should mention that, because I did some research and I found out I contacted a historian, Mark Wade, over at the Cape, and he's been keeping up with all the launches, and I emailed him and asked him how many Minuteman launches had there ever been, and specifically over the Cape, and he says, well, Minuteman 1, 2, and 3, there were exactly 92 launches. And I said, but there's only 91 listed in your chronology. And then he says, oh, well, I don't know why that would be. So I went back and researched, and I only came up with 91. And the last one that was launched, I've got the date here, but I believe it was in November of 1967. That was the last Minuteman launch from Cape Canaveral.
That they have officially listed.
Officially listed. And then the next one was in, I've got the date, but I believe it was in January, February of 68. So I thought, well, now why would they not list that one launch,
which was on New Year's
Eve, 1967, interestingly enough.
Mm-hmm.
What an odd time to launch a missile.
Yeah.
You know?
Yes, was it really truly an exercise, or was it intent upon interacting with whatever this object was that rose back from the ground and went up into the sky?
You know, I think I'd lean towards your implication, because I've never heard of a launch going on a night like this,
mm-hmm.
on a New Year's Eve weekend.
Right.
So,
did you ever get to hear or learn anything from anybody off the record about what might have happened?
Okay, I found a website, and I won't at this time use his name, because he asked that I not use his name, because evidently but he did work. He worked doing the Apollo program, and he was very, very high profile employee, and he was rubbed elbows with some of the astronauts, and he was very, very familiar with a lot of the Minuteman program launches. Well, I emailed him, and I put a date on him, and that was the December 30th, 1967 event, and he didn't email me until a couple of weeks later, and then when he finally did, he said, I had to think about contacting you because of the sensitivity of this matter that's still ongoing about our Minuteman rockets and UFOs. So he says, but I know you're not lying because I know of the incident. And he said at the time, his group, as he referred to it, were well aware of the incident that I talked about that I wrote about in my email.
Mm-hmm.
He says, but not to the degree of the detail that you shared with me in your letter.
Mm-hmm.
So, yes, it was well known at the time.
Among people who worked at Cape Canaveral.
Among people who worked at the Cape, yes.
And did he tell you any information that you didn't know?
No. Not, you mean about that night?
Right, about the object, about the missile, about the jets, about the helicopters.
We're going to find out about all of them in just a moment. This is Whitley Strieber. It's Dreamland. We'll be right back. This is Whitley Strieber. It's Dreamland. We're back listening to this extraordinary story of UFO events at Cape Canaveral.
He told me that they had only known about, from their point of view, from what he had heard, their tracking and their telemetry locked onto this object. That was their take on it. And then I guess somebody had gone out and did a visual on the UFO and saw it from that perspective.
Okay, which thing had locked onto which thing first? The UFO had locked onto...
Yes, excuse me. The tracking and the telemetry that works with the missile as it's going up moved onto the UFO, and I guess everybody was the launch control, whoever's in charge of destroying the rocket. They were a little they didn't know what to do because they couldn't, their rocket integrity had been
compromised.
And
the part that could always be hidden from the public and the media would be that there had actually been a lock-on interchange between a Minuteman missile off of Cape Canaveral with an unidentified aerial object.
Correct.
And then why?
Exactly. The why is still a mystery, because this is the one out of all of the UFO Minuteman missile related events, however you want to categorize that. This one here is yet to surface.
You can see some of Jim Oglesby's drawings of this experience at my website, www.earthfiles.com. At the headlines page, it's the Apollo program, Cape Canaveral, and UFOs report, with a hot link that goes directly to this report I've done for Dreamland. And Whitley, there is so much in this man's experiences from that 1960s period, and I thought it would be worth noting that 1 year later, in February of 1969, blue lights were flashing around in that area that is about 20-30 miles west of Cape Canaveral. And one night he was seeing blue lights, and a farmer stopped in a car, and he learned from the farmer that during this period of time that these blue lights and these other strange lights had been showing up, the farmer had lost cattle, meaning cattle were disappearing. Then, in that same period of time, in about spring of 1968, he was talking with some other people at a time when they were seeing some of these bizarre flashing lights in the air, and met a farmer who said, and this is a quote, "In 1964, we found a heifer out on our spread, and I don't know why anybody would do this. It was our most friendly animal, and it was just in the best of health. But we found the mouth open, we looked inside, and the tongue had been removed. He said it was like as if somebody had come in with some special surgical tools and removed the tongue. He said it was so precise, and that it has been a mystery to this day," which of course dovetails into the worldwide animal mutilation phenomenon, which I've tried to get to the bottom of since 1979.
You have to wonder always, why didn't they just land with flags waving after coming all of this distance, or wherever or they have come from, or whatever they are? It has to be creepy and full of battles and alarms in the night, and it does make one feel terribly lonely, because in all of this big universe with trillions upon trillions of stars, this is what we got.
And what is the reason, and what does our government really know, and are they meeting with any of these people in the dark at night west of Cape Canaveral? Jim Oglesby saw cars pull up sometimes in these places where these alleged craft would land, and he said, what is going on between our government and what's in these craft?
Well, Linda, it's a source of incredible frustration for all of us, and especially, I think, for those of us who have faced whatever was in the craft in the night, to know that somewhere there are people who drive up in cars and meet them that way. It's as cruel a thing as I think a government can do, what this one does. And on that note, this is Whitley.
Obviously, a big conspiracy. To be able to move that number of hijackers, to be able to get them through normal security, to be able to get at least 4 commercial airliners. And Whitley, you know as well as I do that there is some evidence to suggest that there may have been more included in the original plan, but for one reason or another it ended up 4. But still, for that to have happened takes considerable planning, considerable expertise, obviously lots of money, and long-range planning. So my next thought was, we need to stop and not let our emotions get the better of us at this particular point in time, and we need to calmly and coolly find out who is truly behind these attacks and make sure that they are punished and that they never happen again. And in fact, I published something to that very extent on September the 12th, the very next day.
On September the 12th?
Yes.
Wow.
And I said, this is, this is, already they were comparing it to Pearl Harbor, which is a very apropos comparison, but not for the reason that most people think. They think, oh yeah, it was another dastardly sneak attack. Well, what we know now about Pearl Harbor, and has become abundantly clear and is generally accepted, is that President Roosevelt, George Marshall, a handful of others, very ranking government people, knew that Pearl Harbor was going to be attacked. And they allowed it to happen to further their own political aims, which at that time was to galvanize the American public. Now, September the 11th, I think, if you'll actually study the available information, is the exact same thing. There were people high within the government who obviously knew this was going to happen. We have the arrest of members of an Al-Qaeda cell in the Philippines back in 1995, where they uncovered the plans for Operation Bojinka, which called for hijacking airplanes and flying them into targets. You have the warnings that were coming up through the ranks and files of the CIA and the FBI, which have now...
Tell us what must have been going on in that man's mind while he sat and waited, in my opinion, to make sure it all unfolded without his intervention.
Right. Now, yes, I think I can, and actually, on the one hand, it's kind of the defense for Bush, okay? Because what I have found and what I document in my book, Inside Job, is that this has not been widely publicized, but on the morning of September the 11th, 2001, when Richard Clark, the then head of counterterrorism, called NORAD and asked if fighters had been scrambled, the first thing he was told was, we're in the middle of an exercise. Whitley, they had a war game going on, okay? And it was called, Clark refers to it in his book as Valiant Warrior. My information is the true name was Valiant Guardian. And they were running these scenarios. And also, according to the information I have, one of the scenarios was that hijackers had hijacked commercial airliners and were going to fly them into prominent buildings. So in other words, the answer for the lack of response is that when the air traffic controllers began to report airplanes off course, out of touch, when the first reports came in and said a plane has crashed into the World Trade Center, when George Bush was told a plane has crashed into the World Trade Center, the thought was, oh, it's part of the exercise. But now this leads to even deeper, darker questions, and to me proves up the point of my title, Inside Job. Because what we now know is that the day before, the National Security Agency had intercepted an electronic communication from Mohammed Atta, who we are told was the leader of the hijackers, and he says, the match begins. Tomorrow is 0 hour. The match. He didn't say the operation begins, the op is on, the battle starts. He said the match, which is another now been made public. But it's been spread out over a period of time, so most people don't realize how voluminous these warnings actually were. We were getting warnings from everybody, including Russia, including the Taliban in Afghanistan, warning that Osama bin Laden was about to launch a major attack. Okay, and yet nothing was done. Now, what you're going to find out in my new book, Inside Job, is that there is an explanation for the most widespread criticisms of the Bush administration on that day, and that was the singular lack of response to these attacks. Where were our interceptor aircraft? Where were the missile batteries that ring Washington, D.C.? Where were the alarm bells going off within the FAA and the tight communications between the FAA and NORAD, the North American Air Defense Command? And why did President Bush continue to read a story of a billy goat to school kids after he had been informed that a second plane had struck the World Trade Center and that America was under attack?
You know, Jim, when I was in the theater watching 911, and I certainly, even though I'm not a lefty at all, I went to it because I think that what is happening is very far beyond the normal politics.
Exactly.
Where we are right now has nothing to do with your political ideology. We're in trouble with people who are using a certain political ideology to do something that is very different from what those who believe in conservatism would want them to do if they knew what was going on. And I sat in that theater, and during the time where they had the imagery of Bush just sitting there staring at with this funny little look on his face, and there were people sobbing. There were sounds of people suppressing fear, little noises like that in the theater, dead silence. And I had to tell you, I thought of you, and I thought, I wonder if Jim can...
Word for the game. So in other words, this leads to the big question. How did the hijackers know when to coordinate their true attack with this war game that had a similar scenario?
Jim,
and it could only have come from somebody within our own government.
Within our government.
It's
okay.
An inside job.
Listen to this. On 25 September of 2001, Unknown Country published a story that went almost nowhere in the media. Terrorists had our secret codes.
Yes.
Official sources now confirm the terrorists knew the White House codes and a number of secret signals, meaning that Air Force One containing President Bush could have become the terrorists' next target. Now, during 9/11, the movie, Michael Moore mentions in passing that they were using cell phones to communicate from Air Force One because they couldn't even use their own communication system. Now, apparently...
Because it had been compromised.
It had been compromised from within.
Exactly.
Now, let's race forward to the...
well, wait, before you get past that,
sure.
Let me add one little coda here. This is something that really boggles my mind, and I'm not sure you've even thought about this.
I probably haven't.
When Bush made his trip to Florida, it was a publicity thing. You know, he's going there to take photo op pictures with the school kids. They had published the motorcade route. They knew which airport he was landing at and what the motorcade route was to the school and the route back to Air Force One. Okay? Now, going there, that's fine. But once at the school, he's informed that America's under attack. They now know they have our secret codes. They now know and believe that Air Force One and the President himself may be the object of an attack.
We have to take a break, Jim.
Whisk him off by a secret route? No. They quietly go back the very same route that they had already publicly announced. They go back to Air Force One, which takes off without any jet fighter escort.
We have to take a break. This is Whitley Strieber. It's Dreamland. We'll be right back. Excited today because we have Jim Marrs with us. Jim has been studying 9/11 ever since it happened. He wrote The War on Freedom. HarperCollins censored it. He had to publish it privately. Now he's back with a revised version of it called Inside Job, plus a remarkable new DVD. He's going to be talking about it to our subscribers. One of the most incredible paranormal events ever, The Secret of Red Gate. Jim, I'm so glad to have you on the program.
Oh, Whitley, it's always good to be with you.
Well, it's always exciting to have you, and I really, in reading Inside Job, I began to see that you have gone beyond where you were with the War on Freedom in a lot of different ways.
Right.
But let me just begin by asking you, if I may, where this all began for you. You must have, like the rest of us, waked up to 911 on that day. What was going through the mind of Jim Marrs that morning?
Okay. Yeah, you're right. Since I stay up late at night, I was still pretty much in bed when the phone rang, and it was my wife calling from school saying, "You better get up. New York is under attack." And, of course, my first thought was, what the heck is she talking about?
Yeah.
And immediately turned on the TV, and I was in time to see the reporting on the time to sit there and watch the plane crashing into the South Tower as it happened, and of course I was simply stunned like everybody else, like what in the world is happening here. As the day progressed, though, I very quickly came to the idea that this was a conscious attack. Another thing that struck me was that, we've had a lot of things happen, like the Murrah Federal Building bombing and the bombing of the World Trade Center back in 1993. And in all those instances, the general idea was that, well, this is not any big conspiracy. But this was obvious.